Imagine a world where each day felt uncertain, where whispers of illness moved faster than the wind, and where the ordinary rhythm of life, tending the fields, baking bread, gathering at church, was suddenly interrupted by fear. Tonight, we are stepping back into that haunting moment of history, the Black Death in Europe. Before we begin, tell me something. Which country are you watching from, and what time is it right now, as you listen? Let your thoughts slow down as we explore this time not through battles or kings, but through the eyes of everyday people who lived in the shadow of the plague. The Black Death did not arrive all at once. It began like a distant storm on the horizon, first whispered in stories carried along trade routes. Merchants spoke of strange illnesses sweeping across Asia, caravans carrying both goods and tales of death. By the late 1340s, those stories reached Europe, arriving with ships docking in Mediterranean ports, ships that carried not only spices and cloth but also rats, and the fleas upon them. At first, people did not understand what they faced. In a small village, a farmer might hear from a traveling merchant that a great sickness had struck in Italy, or in the bustling port of Marseille. The words sounded distant, almost unbelievable, as if describing another world. Yet soon enough, the illness came closer, creeping inland along roads and rivers, spreading from city to town, from town to village. The symptoms shocked those who witnessed them. Accounts describe sudden fevers, weakness, and the appearance of dark swellings, buboes, under the skin, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings turned black and painful, giving the disease its later name. The speed was terrifying. A healthy neighbor might be seen at market one day, and by the next, word would spread that they had fallen ill. Within a few days, they were gone. For ordinary people, life quickly shifted from the predictable cycle of work and worship to one of dread and uncertainty. Farmers who once thought only of harvests now worried about survival. Families prayed more earnestly, while townsfolk avoided crowded markets and gatherings. Some communities turned inward, hoping isolation would protect them, while others clung to faith, seeking answers in sermons, processions, and desperate prayers. The fear grew not only from death itself, but from the mystery surrounding it. No one knew its cause. Some thought it was the anger of God, punishment for sin. Others blamed foul air, known as miasma, rising from swamps or decaying matter. Still others whispered of outsiders or strangers carrying curses. Without knowledge of bacteria or contagion, explanations were born of fear, faith, and imagination. And so, the world of medieval Europe, already fragile, already bound by the rhythms of nature, began to unravel under the weight of this unseen enemy. In the countryside, villagers often heard rumors long before they saw the disease with their own eyes. News traveled slowly along dusty roads, carried by travelers or peddlers who paused to sell wares and exchange stories. Many dismissed the early warnings. After all, sickness was nothing new to peasants. Life had always been marked by fevers, hunger, and sudden death. But this plague was different, though few recognized it at first. When the first signs did appear in rural areas, they were often devastating. A single case could spread quickly among households that lived close together, with families sharing cramped cottages and entire villages relying on the same wells or streams. In a world without doctors nearby, peasants turned to what they knew: herbs, charms, whispered prayers, and the wisdom of elders. Women gathered plants thought to cleanse the air, while men burned fires of fragrant wood to drive away what they believed were poisoned mists. In towns, the impact came faster and more visibly. Crowded streets, busy markets, and close quarters provided the perfect conditions for the illness to spread. Merchants who once filled stalls with cloth, spices, and tools now closed their shops, afraid of contact. City officials ordered attempts at cleansing the air. Bonfires burned day and night, and barrels of vinegar were left open in the streets to absorb corruption. Some towns even passed ordinances banning strangers from entering. But by the time such laws were made, the plague was often already within the walls. The clergy faced a heavy burden. Priests, monks, and nuns were called to visit the sick, to administer last rites, and to comfort grieving families. Many did so bravely, exposing themselves to danger in their duty to the dying. Yet others, overwhelmed by fear, withdrew. Some monasteries closed their gates, refusing entry to outsiders. In churches, prayers and processions increased, with people gathering in hope of divine mercy, though ironically, these gatherings may have spread the disease even further. Everywhere, uncertainty reigned. A village might interpret the plague as a divine punishment and organize a day of fasting and repentance. In a nearby town, doctors dressed in long robes, with masks stuffed with herbs, tried to purify the air and treat the sick, though with little success. Meanwhile, wealthy families fled to their country estates, hoping that distance from crowded towns would bring safety. But for the majority, peasants tied to the land, artisans bound to their workshops, and laborers dependent on daily wages, escape was not an option. They faced the plague where they lived, in small cottages, in crowded streets, or within cloistered walls. For them, survival became a matter of chance, resilience, and faith. As the weeks turned to months, what began as rumor became undeniable reality. The Black Death had arrived, and with it, the fabric of everyday life began to fray in ways no one could have imagined. Markets, once the lifeblood of medieval towns and villages, were among the first routines to collapse. Where stalls once rang with the cries of merchants selling fish, bread, or bolts of cloth, silence fell. Some markets closed altogether, fearing the gathering of crowds, while others operated only in half measures, with sellers standing apart and refusing to touch coins directly. It was not uncommon to see money dropped into bowls of vinegar before being accepted, as though the sour liquid could wash away death itself. In the countryside, farming cycles faltered. Spring planting went unfinished in many places, as laborers fell ill, and fields that had been carefully plowed lay abandoned. Sheep and cattle wandered untended, sometimes dying in the fields from neglect rather than disease. Grain rotted in barns when no one remained healthy enough to thresh and store it. The rhythm of agricultural life, once steady and dependable across generations, became uneven and uncertain. Some villages produced almost nothing one year, relying on whatever stores remained or bartering with neighbors. The rituals of death themselves changed in unsettling ways. In times past, burials were solemn events. Bells rang, priests led processions, and families gathered to mourn with dignity. Under the plague, these customs faltered. In towns, cemeteries filled faster than graves could be dug. Trenches were opened to receive the bodies of dozens at once. Priests, overwhelmed by the constant demand, recited prayers quickly, sometimes from a distance, unwilling to linger. In villages, it was not unusual for neighbors to bury one another when priests were absent or too frightened to attend. Even the care for the dead, once a sign of devotion and love, grew hurried and impersonal. Shrouds were sometimes abandoned altogether, and coffins were rare. Survivors often had little choice but to carry bodies wrapped in whatever cloth was available, leaving them in the earth without ceremony. Families, terrified of infection, sometimes refused to touch their own kin, forcing burial crews to collect the dead in carts. The sight of such carts rattling through narrow streets, filled with shrouded figures, became one of the most haunting images of the era. Yet, amid all this, people still sought ways to maintain a thread of normalcy. Bakers still lit their ovens when they could, blacksmiths still hammered iron, and farmers still rose at dawn to tend what livestock remained. These small acts of continuity offered a fragile sense of stability, a reminder that not all of life had been swept away. But even these efforts were shadowed by uncertainty, for no one knew if tomorrow would bring health or death. The first stage of the Black Death, then, was not only about sickness, but about disruption. Routines that had anchored life for centuries, market days, planting seasons, funeral rites, were fractured. In their place came improvisation, fear, and a constant sense of fragility. As the pestilence lingered, people began to look for explanations. Medieval life was deeply shaped by faith, ritual, and tradition, and when such calamity struck, the search for meaning was as urgent as the struggle to survive. Many believed the plague was a punishment sent by God for sins unconfessed and indulgences unrepented. Sermons resounded with warnings of divine wrath, urging repentance and prayer as the only shield against death. Pilgrims set out to shrines, though often these journeys ended with contagion spreading further along the roads. Superstition grew alongside religious devotion. In some towns, people carried amulets of herbs and stones, hoping to ward off the invisible menace. Strong-smelling substances, rosemary, vinegar, or even crushed garlic, were thought to purify the air, for many believed the plague traveled through foul vapors, known as me. Bonfires were lit in public squares to cleanse the atmosphere, though they did little more than fill the streets with smoke. Fear and rumor spread as quickly as the disease itself. Foreigners, strangers, or even neighbors could be accused of bringing the sickness into town. Wells were said to be poisoned, or food cursed. In some places, these suspicions led to violence, as frightened communities lashed out against those they believed responsible. The bonds of trust that once held villages and towns together grew strained, leaving people wary of one another. Yet, even in these dark times, moments of resilience surfaced. Families gathered more closely, spending evenings in prayer or storytelling, finding comfort in the company of those who still lived. Songs were sung in hushed tones, not of celebration, but of remembrance and hope. In monasteries, monks continued to copy texts, believing that the preservation of knowledge itself was a form of resistance against oblivion. The atmosphere of Europe during the first waves of the Black Death was therefore one of contradiction. Deep faith and deep fear, superstition and resilience, despair and determination. People moved between these states daily, never certain whether the morning would bring recovery or ruin. As mortality rose 2 levels unseen in memory, towns and villages began to devise crude measures of protection. Guards were sometimes posted at city gates to prevent travelers from entering, though desperate merchants often found ways around them. Ships arriving in harbors were occasionally ordered to wait offshore. Their crews kept aboard for weeks to ensure no signs of sickness appeared. Though primitive by modern standards, these measures marked the beginnings of what we now recognize as quarantine. Daily rhythms became fragmented under the weight of constant loss. Markets that once bustled with trade stood half empty, for both buyers and sellers feared contact. Artisans laid down their tools as customers vanished. Harvests went ungathered in many regions, and fields turned wild with neglect. The simplest tasks, baking bread, tending animals, fetching water, were carried out with unease, for any encounter might bring death closer to the household. Burial practices changed swiftly, for the sheer number of dead overwhelmed existing customs. Churchyards filled to capacity, and hastily dug trenches were created at the edges of towns. Clergy and gravediggers worked tirelessly, yet even they succumbed in large numbers, leaving communities scrambling to find anyone willing to handle the bodies. Bells that once rang for single funerals tolled, almost constantly, blending sorrow into the background of daily life. The sense of time itself altered. Weeks were measured not by feast days or seasons, but by the steady rhythm of loss. A family might pass from health to grief within days, and neighbors learned to avoid one another's doors. Those who survived the initial waves often carried with them a haunted stillness, as though uncertain how long their reprieve might last. In this atmosphere, the familiar order of medieval life cracked open. Institutions that had once seemed immovable, the parish, the manor, the guild, were shaken. The plague was not only a physical disease, It was a social upheaval, loosening bonds that had tied people to land, Lord, and church for centuries. As the plague spread further, explanations multiplied in whispered conversations and public sermons. Many believed the sickness was a punishment sent by God for the sins of humanity. Others thought the alignment of the stars and planets had poisoned the very air, a theory drawn from the astrology of the time. Suspicion often fell upon outsiders, strangers, travelers, or minority groups who were accused of poisoning wells or spreading illness deliberately. Such fears sometimes erupted into violence, adding human cruelty to the devastation of disease. Superstition guided behavior in countless ways. Some families carried charms or herbs in the hope of warding off infection. Juniper, rosemary, or even garlic might be hung above doorways, their scents believed to cleanse the air of corruption. Doctors wore long, beaked masks stuffed with aromatic substances, a grim symbol of both professional effort and desperate futility. Meanwhile, acts of public penitence became widespread. Processions of flagellants wound their way through towns and villages, groups of men who whipped themselves in the open streets, believing their suffering might atone for the sins of the world and persuade God to end the pestilence. Crowds gathered to watch them, torn between awe and fear. As the sound of chanting mingled with the lash of leather against flesh, art and imagination also shifted under the shadow of mortality. In illuminated manuscripts, tiny skeletons and grotesque figures began to appear, reminders that death was no longer a distant possibility but a constant companion. Church murals showed scenes of the dance of death, where kings, merchants, peasants, and clergy alike were drawn into the same skeletal procession. These images reflected the stark truth that plague recognized no boundaries of wealth or rank. Daily speech became colored by new phrases of dread. To speak of a neighbor was often to say, "He was well yesterday," a reminder of how swiftly life could change. Letters, where they survived, are marked by sudden silences, names crossed out, sentences left unfinished, as if the pen itself had been seized mid-thought by the calamity. And through all of this, a quiet endurance lingered. Those who remained alive still had to bake bread, draw water, and tend animals, even as grief pressed heavily upon them. The ordinary tasks of life became acts of defiance, each gesture proof that humanity had not yet yielded entirely to despair. The movement of the plague across Europe was uneven and unpredictable. It often followed the routes of trade caravans and merchant ships, appearing suddenly in port cities before creeping inland along rivers and roads. Grain sacks carried not just food but also fleas and rats, silent travelers that turned ordinary commerce into channels of devastation. In some towns, the disease arrived with terrifying speed. A single infected traveler might pass through a marketplace, coughing or feverish, and within days entire households would fall ill. In other places, weeks of rumor and dread preceded the first confirmed deaths, as news filtered in from nearby villages. People lived in a constant state of waiting, unsure if the pestilence would come tomorrow or pass them by altogether. The response of authorities varied. In certain cities, officials attempted to impose primitive forms of quarantine. Strangers were barred from entering. Guards patrolled gates, and households showing symptoms were locked inside with their sick. Yet such measures were often too late or too limited. The disease ignored walls and laws alike, slipping through borders that seemed, in other times, secure. Travelers became both carriers and messengers. Pilgrims returning from shrines, merchants crossing mountain passes, soldiers retreating from campaigns, all brought with them not just goods or stories, but the invisible seeds of plague. With them came whispers, tales of entire villages abandoned, of fields overgrown because no one remained to work them, of church bells tolling without cease. The atmosphere of rumor shaped people's decisions as much as reality. Some fled to the countryside, believing the open air would spare them, while others crowded into churches, trusting holy ground to shield them. These movements often hastened the spread, creating new clusters of contagion in places once untouched. The natural world itself seemed to echo the fear. Chroniclers wrote of strange weather, heavy rains, unseasonal heat, or sudden storms that felt like omens. Some claimed that animals, too, sensed the sickness, dogs howling at night, or birds vanishing from certain regions. To a medieval mind, these signs reinforced the belief that something far greater than human control was at work. Amidst the rising toll, silence also spread. Streets once filled with chatter grew eerily quiet. Inns closed their doors, workshops stood empty, and market squares became places where only the desperate gathered. The absence of noise was, in its way, as frightening as the presence of death, for those who lived through it. One of the most unsettling aspects of the plague was not only the speed of death, but also the collapse of ordinary patterns of life. Familiar routines, market days, church feasts, even the simple ringing of bells to mark the hours were interrupted or abandoned. What had once been reliable rhythms suddenly felt fragile, as if the very fabric of time itself was coming apart. Neighbors who once trusted one another began to draw back. Doors were bolted, shutters closed, and conversations shouted from windows instead of spoken face to face. Fear of contact grew so intense in some towns that even acts of charity, offering bread, fetching water, tending to the sick, became rare. To touch another person was to risk one's life. The absence of burial rituals was particularly painful. In many communities, it became impossible to give the dead proper rites. Graves were dug hastily, sometimes in fields outside the town, sometimes in masked pits where dozens of bodies were lowered together. The lack of ceremony left survivors with an annoying sense of unfinished duty. The spiritual comfort of farewell, so deeply woven into medieval life, was often denied. Children, too, felt the disorientation. Some were left without parents, wandering streets in search of food. Others were taken in by relatives who already struggled to feed their own. Chroniclers note that many grew silent and withdrawn, no longer playing in lanes or fields. Their world of games and stories had been overshadowed by the constant sight of illness and mourning. Communities carried an invisible weight of dread. Every cough or fever was suspect. Every sudden absence whispered about. The fear was not only of the plague itself, but of what it revealed, how fragile their villages, towns, and even kingdoms truly were. Walls, wealth, and social order all could be undone by a force that arrived unseen and unstoppable. In this atmosphere, the collective imagination turned inward. People dreamed vividly of death, spoke of visions, and interpreted chance events as signs. A sudden gust of wind or a falling star became part of a tapestry of fear. Rumors spread that entire provinces were wiped out, or that seas themselves had turned dark with divine wrath. As the weeks turned to months, the mental strain became a constant companion. It was not only the bodies that were weakened, but the spirit of communities themselves. Where once there had been bustling trade and gatherings, there now lingered an air of waiting for news, waiting for relief, waiting for the plague to pass. Even though few believed it truly would, when the plague swept across Europe, people did not see it as an accident of nature. In a world where faith touched nearly every moment of life, explanations were sought in the heavens, in sin, and in divine anger. Many believed the Black Death was God's punishment, a scourge sent to remind humanity of its wickedness. Sermons thundered with calls for repentance, and towns organized processions where barefoot penitents carried candles and sang hymns through the streets. Others turned to more mystical interpretations. Some thought the planets themselves had aligned in a way that corrupted the very air. Astrologers studied the skies, noting eclipses or strange conjunctions, and wrote treatises claiming these cosmic signs foretold pestilence. In smoky taverns and quiet farmhouses alike, people repeated these theories, trying to fit their grief into a pattern they could understand. Superstitions flourished in the cracks left by uncertainty. Charms were worn against the plague, amulets of herbs, coins with sacred images, or tiny scrolls of prayer tied around the neck. In some villages, fires were lit in the streets, in the hope that smoke and warmth would cleanse the air. Elsewhere, people carried bouquets of strong-smelling flowers or herbs, pressing them to their noses as they walked, convinced the sweet scent would shield them from corrupted air. Fear also bred suspicion. Outsiders, strangers passing through town, or communities already marginalized, were sometimes blamed for the spread of the disease. There are records of wells being accused of deliberate poisoning, or certain groups being punished for supposedly inviting divine wrath. In this way, the terror of the plague not only weakened bodies, but also fractured trust among neighbors. Monks and priests, often the first called to comfort the dying, became both heroes and victims. Many continued their duties, administering last rites, at great personal risk. Entire monasteries were emptied, their libraries and cloisters silent, as one by one the brothers succumbed. To the faithful, this was both a tragedy and a sign. If even holy men could fall, then the plague was a force beyond earthly defense. Yet not all responses were solemn. In some places, groups of flagellants appeared, bands of men and women who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares. They believed their suffering might balance the sins of the world and turn aside divine anger. Crowds gathered to watch these grim processions, half in awe, half in fear that such spectacles might draw even greater punishment. Through all of this, people searched desperately for meaning. The Black Death was not just an illness. It was a question without an answer. Each community crafted its own response, from prayer to ritual, from suspicion to silence. And still the bells tolled, marking the rhythm of loss, louder than any explanation could be. The Black Death did not strike every community in the same way. In crowded towns and cities, the impact was swift and devastating. Narrow streets, shared wells, and clusters of homes pressed tightly together created the perfect environment for contagion to spread. Markets, where people from distant villages mingled daily, became sites of both commerce and contagion. Within weeks, entire neighborhoods were emptied, shutters nailed closed, and the sounds of daily business replaced by the echo of silence. The countryside, while more dispersed, was not spared. Villages might hold out longer, their relative isolation offering brief protection. Yet once the pestilence reached them, the blow was no less severe. Families lived together in close quarters, often with their animals indoors for warmth, making the spread of disease almost unavoidable. Unlike towns, where physicians and clergy might attempt some measures of care, rural communities often faced the plague alone, with no one to guide them but local healers or the wisdom of elders. Fields, once carefully tended, grew wild in many regions. Crops were left to wither, not for lack of rain but for lack of hands to work them. Livestock wandered untended, sometimes perishing in barns, sometimes roaming abandoned roads. The rhythm of agricultural life, the sowing, reaping, and gathering was disrupted, and with it, the stability of food supplies. Hunger often followed in the plague's wake. The social effects also diverged. In towns, fear bred suspicion of strangers. In villages, grief often fractured families themselves. Entire households might vanish, leaving cottages empty, their hearths cold. In some cases, survivors from multiple families would band together under one roof, pooling strength and resources. In others, isolation deepened, with those left behind wary of any contact beyond their own door. Even the landscape bore witness. In cities, makeshift cemeteries filled empty plots where houses once stood. In the countryside, burial mounds rose in fields and pastures, marked with hastily carved crosses. Travelers could see the story written in the land itself, patches of silence where once there had been life. This uneven impact shaped the way people remembered the plague. Urban chronicles spoke of mass graves, public processions, and the closing of city gates. Rural memories lingered on abandoned fields, hungry winters, and the sudden emptiness of once busy cottages. Together, these fragments painted a picture of a continent where no corner, no matter how remote, escaped untouched. Even in regions where the plague had not yet arrived, its shadow was already present through the power of rumor. News traveled along the same roads as merchants and pilgrims, often distorted as it went. A tale that began with a description of illness in a distant town might, by the time it reached the next village, have grown into stories of whole provinces emptied overnight. Fear fed imagination. People repeated accounts of ships adrift at sea, their crews all dead, but their sails still catching the wind. Some swore they had seen villages where dogs and cattle outnumbered the living, or markets where only the tolling of a bell remained. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, became part of the shared experience of the Black Death, amplifying the sense that no place was safe. Chroniclers and clerks tried to capture these tales in writing, but most memory lived, orally passed from mother to child, from traveler to innkeeper, from priest to congregation, in the flicker of hearth fires and the echo of churches. Stories became warnings of God's wrath, of human sin, of the invisible dangers lurking in the air itself. The very act of speaking about the plague became a form of preparation. Villagers sharpened their fears into narratives, imagining what they would do if the sickness came. Some promised to flee into forests or hills, while others vowed to remain, trusting in their faith or their land. The plague was not only a disease of the body, it was a story reshaping how people saw the world before it even reached them. For some, silence was the only response. There are records of towns where the usual chatter of marketplaces diminished, not because the pestilence had struck, but because everyone was listening, waiting for the first sign. It was as though entire communities held their breath, bracing for a storm they could not see, but could not deny. And so, even before the Black Death's full arrival, its presence was already felt everywhere, in the words people spoke, in the rumors they passed, and in the heavy hush that settled over towns and villages as they awaited what seemed inevitable. As the plague advanced, the lifelines of medieval Europe began to fray. Trade routes that had once carried cloth, grain, and wine now carried unease. Merchants grew reluctant to journey to fairs, fearful of catching the sickness or of being barred entry at town gates. Some caravans turned back halfway, while ships sat idle in harbors, their crews unwilling to risk strange shores. The bustling exchanges that once stitched regions together fell into uneasy silence. Markets dwindled. Stalls that had been crammed with wool, pottery, and spices became bare, not only because of death, but because of fear itself. Buyers hesitated to handle goods, worried they carried contagion, while sellers often vanished, too ill or too afraid to appear. Even coins were viewed with suspicion, passed with reluctance, or doused in vinegar before being touched. Governance, too, faltered. Local lords who prided themselves on order found their retainers dead or their peasants fleeing. Town councils met less frequently, sometimes unable to gather enough members to function. Edicts were posted, warning against gatherings or ordering streets to be cleaned, yet enforcement was patchy. In some regions, officials abandoned their posts altogether, retreating to manors or country houses in the hope of escaping infection. Travelers faced a changed world. Inns that once welcomed pilgrims and merchants closed their doors, windows boarded and doors barred. Bridges were watched, crossroads guarded, and strangers viewed with suspicion. What had once been a network of connection now became a patchwork of barriers. Even letters and messengers were caught in this net of fear. Some towns refused correspondence from neighboring regions, burning sealed packets unopened. The simple act of communication, which had tied communities together, became fraught with anxiety. Through all this, a strange contradiction arose. While roads grew emptier, fear itself traveled faster than ever. Stories outran the disease, spreading a kind of contagion of the mind. People withdrew not only from strangers, but even from one another, hollowing out the social bonds that had once given strength to their villages and towns. The breakdown of trade and governance meant that even places not yet touched by the plague felt its effects. Food prices rose, supplies thinned, and the sense of order on which medieval life depended seemed to tremble. It was as though the plague carried not only death, but also disorder, unraveling the threads of connection that made society whole. Even in the earliest phases of the plague's arrival, culture and thought began to shift in ways that revealed deep anxiety. Songs once sung in taverns or fields turned somber, their verses tinged with dread. Children's rhymes, whispered with uneasy laughter, began to mention sickness and death, playful words masking a deeper fear. It was the beginning of a folk memory that would endure long after the plague itself had passed. Artists, too, responded, though often in subtle ways at first. Marginal sketches in manuscripts, once filled with playful beasts and vines, began to feature skeletons or skeletal animals, reminders of mortality creeping into pages of prayer and law alike. Churches, once adorned with triumphant saints and radiant angels, saw more frequent depictions of suffering martyrs or images of Christ's wounds, mirroring the wounds of plague victims themselves. Spiritual practices adapted. Processions once meant to celebrate feast days, transformed into acts of penitence. Men and women walked barefoot through the streets, chanting psalms, carrying candles, and begging for mercy. In some places, groups of flagellants, men who whipped themselves in public as a form of collective repentance, appeared, their processions both shocking and magnetic. They believed the plague was divine punishment, and only the shedding of their own blood could appease God. Symbols of death spread through daily life. The skull, once reserved for scholars, meditations, or monks' reminders of mortality, became more commonly seen. Simple charms or tokens were carved with grim faces or bones, carried as both talisman and warning. Even ordinary objects, a spoon, a spindle, a brooch, might be adorned with small reminders of life's fragility, as though the very fabric of existence had been colored by loss. Literature, too, began to take new form. In Italy, collections of stories such as those later gathered in the Decameron were imagined against the backdrop of the plague, weaving tales of escape, morality, and wit around the silence of abandoned cities. Elsewhere, chronicles written by monks recorded not just the spread of the disease, but the mood it created, astonishment, sorrow, and the sense that the old order of things was crumbling. Even time itself felt altered. Calendars, once measured by feast days and harvests, were increasingly overshadowed by the rhythm of funerals. Bells tolled so often that they lost their distinctiveness, becoming a constant sound in the background of life. Days were no longer remembered for their joys but for who had been buried and how many graves had been dug. Thus, even before the plague reached its deadliest sweep, it had already transformed Europe's imagination. Songs, art, symbols, and prayers shifted in tone, signaling that the world was entering not just a crisis of health, but a profound shift in how life and death were understood. As the first wave of the plague tightened its grip, daily life across Europe could no longer be carried on as before. What began as murmurs of fear and adjustments in ritual deepened into profound disruptions of ordinary existence. The familiar rhythms of village, town, and city were pulled apart, leaving people to reimagine how to eat, work, and even speak to one another in a world shadowed by constant loss. And so, as we leave behind the opening moments of the Black Death's arrival, with its sudden fears, its shifts in culture and ritual, we will move now into the lived reality of those who endured it. We'll draw us closer into the streets, the homes, and the marketplaces, to see how the routines of survival changed, and how daily life itself was reshaped in the presence of the plague. Markets that once bustled with sellers and buyers grew quieter, their stalls half empty as merchants fell ill or refused to travel. Prices for certain goods rose sharply, while others collapsed, depending on who was willing to risk the journey to sell. Bread, once the simplest and most certain of foods, could suddenly be scarce if millers, bakers, or the carters who moved grain from one place to another were struck down. Families began to keep distance from neighbors who had once been friends. In cities, some streets fell silent as entire households were sealed inside, either by choice or by order, while in villages, gossip about who might be sick spread faster than the disease itself. The rhythm of conversation shifted. Laughter gave way to whispers, and gatherings that had once been joyful were marked by unease. Inside households, survival required constant adjustment. Families who once relied on strong communal ties were forced to turn inward, creating a smaller circle of care and labor. A mother might take on the tasks of both nurse and provider if her husband fell ill, while children were expected to help in ways beyond their years, fetching water, grinding grain, or tending to animals. The idea of childhood, already shorter in the Middle Ages than in later centuries, seemed to vanish altogether under the strain of the plague. Work itself was reshaped by absence. On farms, unplowed fields stretched into weeds when too few hands were left to sow or harvest. In towns, trades faltered when apprentices and masters alike succumbed, leaving workshops quiet and tools untouched on benches. Yet necessity meant that others, often untrained, stepped into roles they would never have held otherwise. A widow might suddenly inherit her husband's trade, learning quickly to manage accounts, barter with suppliers, and oversee labor responsibilities that, under different circumstances, might never have been hers. Markets reflected this shifting labor. Goods that had once been crafted with care grew rougher in finish, the demand for function outweighing the luxury of detail. Shoes might be less fitted, cloth less finely woven, and metal tools cruder, but survival depended more on availability than artistry. The Black Death turned society into a place where good enough became a daily measure of success. At the same time, there was an undercurrent of opportunity. With labor scarce, those who survived could sometimes command higher wages or better terms. A peasant, who had once been bound tightly to the obligations of a manor, might now find room to negotiate, simply because their labor was indispensable. For the first time in generations, the hierarchy of village and estate bent slightly, allowing small but meaningful shifts in power. Religion, already the central pillar of medieval life, took on an even deeper urgency during the Black Death. Churches filled not only with prayers, but with fear. As priests tried to explain suffering through sermons that spoke of divine punishment or the testing of faith, bells tolled more frequently, calling the living to funerals and processions, their mournful sound becoming the background rhythm of plague-stricken towns. But the church itself was not immune to collapse. Monks, nuns, and priests often died while tending to the sick, leaving parishes without spiritual leadership at the very moment people needed comfort most. The absence of clergy forced survivors to find solace in more personal or local forms of faith. Villagers gathered to recite prayers in their homes, or carried charms and relics that promised protection. Faith became less formal and more desperate, woven into daily rituals of survival. Pilgrimages, once acts of devotion, took on new meaning. Some believed that traveling to a holy site could bring miraculous healing, and groups of pilgrims trudged across Europe, carrying candles and chanting hymns. Others joined processions of flagellants, who whipped themselves publicly to atone for the sins they believed had brought the plague. These haunting scenes filled city streets with the sound of chanting, the crack of lashes, and the sight of bloodied backs, reminders of how fear could reshape the very fabric of belief. Not all responses were rooted in faith, however. Suspicion and blame also grew. Rumors spread that outsiders, such as traveling merchants, minorities, or even women accused of witchcraft, were responsible for poisoning wells or angering God. In some places, Communities turned against their neighbors in acts of violence, revealing how quickly solidarity could fracture under the strain of fear. The Black Death, in this way, revealed the fragile line between unity and division. Despite these darker turns, religion remained a compass. Families who lost everything clung to the hope of heaven and reunion with their loved ones. Priests who remained alive adapted to the new rhythm of constant funerals, offering last rites in fields, alleyways, or crowded homes. In these moments, spiritual care became less about grandeur and more about presence. The simple act of prayer at the bedside of the dying. The Black Death did not only test faith, it also shook the very foundations of medieval society. Entire villages were depopulated, leaving once crowded streets eerily quiet. Fields went unplowed, harvests rotted, and mills stood idle as workers succumbed to the disease. The collapse of labor had immediate consequences. Food supplies dwindled, trade slowed, and prices rose in unpredictable patterns. In some regions, the price of grain skyrocketed, while in others, the glut of abandoned goods drove costs downward. Economic rhythms that had once seemed stable now lurched chaotically from one extreme to another. Lords and landowners, accustomed to abundant peasant labor, suddenly faced shortages. Fields that once provided steady income now yielded little because there were not enough workers to tend them. This imbalance of supply and demand gave peasants, for the first time in centuries, a rare kind of bargaining power. Survivors could demand higher wages, lighter obligations, or even move freely to other estates offering better terms. The rigid framework of feudalism began to crack, not through revolt at first, but through necessity. Rulers tried to push back. In England, for example, the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers in 1351, sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and tie peasants back to their lords. Similar measures echoed across Europe, where elites feared losing control of a system that had long worked in their favor. Yet laws were difficult to enforce when laborers could simply walk away, leaving manors and towns desperate to fill the void. The struggle between landowners and peasants became one of the most enduring legacies of the Black Death, setting the stage for uprisings in later decades. Cities, too, reeled from the demographic shock. Urban guilds lost masters and apprentices alike, leaving skilled trades interrupted. Streets that once buzzed with markets fell silent as merchants died or abandoned their shops. Yet in the emptiness, new opportunities emerged. Survivors inherited property, shops, or land from their relatives, and some individuals who had once lived in poverty suddenly found themselves wealthier than ever before. This redistribution of wealth added new layers of complexity to European society, creating both resentment and ambition. Governments struggled to maintain order. Tax revenues plummeted as populations declined, weakening royal treasuries. Military campaigns stalled for lack of men and money, and the 100 Years' War itself entered phases of pause and uncertainty, as both France and England were drained by plague. In some places, law and order frayed entirely. Local militias or bands of survivors enforced their own rules when central authority faltered. Still, not every effect was immediate chaos. Some communities, especially those less directly struck by the plague, experimented with new forms of governance, relief, or communal responsibility. Councils established quarantine measures, closing city gates to travelers, or required houses of the infected to be marked. These were the earliest hints of public health policies in Europe, rudimentary but significant in shaping the way societies thought about disease control. The long shadow of the Black Death lingered well beyond its initial waves, as years turned into decades. The very structure of European society shifted in ways that would have seemed unimaginable before the mid-14th century. Feudal bonds, once considered the unshakable framework of medieval life, weakened under the pressure of demographic collapse and economic change. Lords who had once commanded unquestioned authority over serfs now found themselves negotiating or even pleading for tenants to remain on their lands. In some regions, entire villages vanished, their houses abandoned to the encroaching wilderness. Forests crept back over former farmland, and animals grazed freely where human hands no longer maintained boundaries. For the peasants who survived, this emptiness meant opportunity. Some took over deserted plots, expanding their holdings far beyond what their families had once possessed. The rigid lines between serf and freeman blurred as practical necessity overrode old customs. It was during this period that peasants began testing the limits of their newfound leverage. In England, frustrations boiled over in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, when thousands marched on London demanding fairer treatment, an end to oppressive taxes, and relief from feudal burdens. Though the revolt was suppressed, its memory lingered as a warning. The old order could be challenged. Similar unrest flared in France, where uprisings like the Jacquerie reflected widespread anger at both noble indifference and crushing economic pressure. These revolts did not immediately dismantle the feudal system, but they marked an irreversible shift in the balance of power. The plague also reshaped the church's place in society. Clergy had once been the bedrock of medieval life, offering both spiritual comfort and practical guidance. Yet their inability to protect communities, and the sheer number of priests and monks who died, left many believers disillusioned. Some questioned whether divine authority still held weight, while others turned to personal forms of devotion, mysticism, or local shrines. The late medieval period saw new religious movements emerge, some seeking reform, others experimenting with unorthodox practices, all reflecting the unsettled spiritual landscape that the Black Death had carved. Education and knowledge, too, felt the ripple. With so many clerics gone, cathedral schools and universities faced shortages of teachers. Yet paradoxically, this decline opened doors for a broader group of students. Sons of merchants, craftsmen, and even prosperous peasants found their way into institutions that had once been dominated by the children of elites. The circulation of new ideas, combined with the questioning spirit that arose from crisis, helped lay early groundwork for the intellectual currents that would later blossom into the Renaissance. Economically, patterns of trade began to recover, but they never looked the same. Guilds reorganized, towns offered incentives to attract new settlers, and governments experimented with new taxation systems to rebuild their revenue. Land that had lost value during the crisis slowly regained it, but under altered conditions. More flexible labor arrangements emerged, including wage contracts and tenant farming agreements, which eroded the strictures of serfdom further. Even the landscape of art and culture bore the imprint of the plague. Across Europe, frescoes, manuscripts, and carvings displayed imagery of death, skeletons, grim reapers, and the famous motif of the Dance of Death, in which peasants, nobles, and kings alike were shown led to the grave. These were not merely morbid decorations. They were a collective acknowledgement of shared mortality, a cultural attempt to find meaning in the upheaval. The Black Death, in this way, was etched into the very soul of Europe. One of the most striking consequences of the Black Death was the way it forced people to grapple with the mysteries of medicine and the body. Medieval Europe did not yet have the tools of modern science, and so explanations of disease often blended observation with religious belief, classical philosophy, and folklore. Physicians relied heavily on the ancient theories of Hippocrates and Galen, particularly the idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, according to this system, came from an imbalance among them, and treatments sought to restore harmony. Bloodletting, for instance, was common. Doctors used leeches or small incisions to remove blood, hoping to draw out the sickness. Herbal remedies, too, were prescribed, ranging from crushed garlic and vinegar poultices to concoctions of sage, rosemary, or wormwood. These remedies often had more symbolic than scientific effect. yet they reflected a genuine effort to heal within the limits of the knowledge available. Beyond humoral theory, people sought protection in aromatic substances. It was believed that foul air, or miasma, carried the plague, so citizens carried posies of herbs, wore masks filled with fragrant spices, or burned juniper and rosemary in their homes. The iconic beaked mask of plague doctors, though more common in later outbreaks, embodied this belief. The beak was stuffed with herbs, intended to purify the air before it reached the lungs. Communities also began experimenting with what we might now call public health measures. Italian city-states, especially Venice, pioneered the use of quarantine. Ships arriving from plague-stricken regions were required to anchor offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, from which the word quarantine comes. This approach was not based on germ theory, which would not be developed for centuries, but it reflected a growing awareness that isolation could slow contagion. Other cities followed suit, closing their gates or setting up pest houses on the outskirts where the sick could be sent. At the same time, ordinary people devised their own folk practices. Some wore amulets inscribed with prayers, others relied on charms, or even carried written verses sewn into their clothing. Superstitions flourished, filling the gaps where medical explanation failed. Stories circulated of miraculous springs, protective saints, or distant lands untouched by plague. Though often ineffective, these practices gave a sense of agency in the face of overwhelming helplessness. Yet medicine was not entirely stagnant. The scale of the crisis spurred careful observation. Chroniclers noted patterns, that the disease seemed to spread more rapidly in crowded towns than in scattered rural villages, or that those in close contact with the sick were at greatest risk. Such observations slowly began to reshape how Europeans thought about contagion. While it would take centuries for modern epidemiology to emerge, the Black Death planted early seeds of inquiry, encouraging some to look more critically at the causes of disease rather than simply accepting divine judgment. The medical profession itself was tested. Physicians, like clergy, often died in great numbers. In some cases, wealthy towns imported doctors from afar, offering high wages to anyone willing to risk their life. Surgeons, apothecaries, and even midwives filled gaps left by university-trained physicians, broadening the spectrum of medical authority. Knowledge became less the monopoly of a few and more scattered among a range of practitioners, many of whom relied on experience rather than theory. In the end, medicine during the Black Death was a patchwork of faith, tradition, and emerging observation. Its failures reflected the limits of the age, but its persistence revealed something deeper, a refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Even in the darkest hours, people sought to heal, to understand, and to impose order on chaos. Kings, princes, and city councils across Europe were also forced to reckon with the devastation. For rulers, the plague was not just a personal tragedy, but a political crisis, one that threatened the very stability of their realms. Armies dwindled as soldiers perished, tax revenues collapsed as populations shrank, and trade routes, once the lifeblood of medieval economies, became perilous corridors of contagion. In England, the Crown issued ordinances to stabilize wages and labor, fearing that the scarcity of workers would allow peasants to demand more than their traditional due. The Statute of Laborers, enacted in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of laborers seeking better conditions. Enforcement, however, proved nearly impossible. Workers often fled their villages or negotiated privately with desperate landowners, undermining royal decrees. The statute reflected both the anxiety of the elite and the futility of trying to legislate away social change. On the continent, similar measures emerged. French authorities imposed controls on markets and attempted to stabilize food supplies, while Italian city-states passed strict laws on sanitation, quarantines, and funerals. In some cities, Specialized health boards were established among the earliest institutions dedicated specifically to managing public health. Their records, which included reports of infections, instructions for burials, and regulations on commerce, mark a tentative step toward bureaucratic responses to disease. Political authority was also tested in matters of faith and order. Some rulers sponsored public processions or built new chapels as acts of piety, hoping to appease divine wrath and reassure their people. Others leaned on repression, punishing those who were accused of spreading panic or disrupting order. In certain towns, harsh penalties were introduced for looting or abandoning civic duties, reflecting the fragility of governance during crisis. Yet even as governments struggled, new forms of resilience appeared. Local councils took on roles once reserved for higher authorities, organizing food distribution, burial services, and the enforcement of quarantine. This decentralization of power revealed the capacity of towns and villages to govern themselves in times of crisis, planting seeds of civic independence that would grow in later centuries. Diplomacy, too, was altered by the plague. Wars slowed or paused, not out of mercy but because armies could no longer be sustained. The 100 Years' War between England and France was periodically disrupted by outbreaks, as disease struck camps with greater ferocity than battle itself. Negotiations between rulers increasingly considered the practical difficulties of maintaining conflict in a time when both soldiers and taxpayers were vanishing. In this way, the Black Death reshaped not only daily life, but also the broader political order. Kings who once appeared distant and untouchable now faced the same vulnerability as their subjects. Some responded with attempts to tighten control, others adapted by granting concessions. In every case, the plague left a mark on the evolving relationship between ruler and ruled. As the immediate waves of plague passed, what lingered most vividly was the way people remembered and retold the experience. The Black Death was not simply an event of statistics and mortality. It became a defining chapter in the cultural imagination of Europe. Storytelling, art, and collective memory all worked to frame what had happened, allowing survivors to grapple with trauma and pass their understanding to future generations. Chroniclers filled manuscripts with stark descriptions. City streets littered with the dead, families abandoning their loved ones, fields gone untended. These accounts, though colored by the perspectives of their authors, offered a powerful record of how deeply the plague altered human life. Some writers interpreted the calamity as divine judgment, carefully noting omens in the sky or earthquakes that seemed to herald the disease. Others, writing with more detachment, tried to measure its spread and impact, foreshadowing the analytical style of later historians. Oral tradition, too, carried the memory. In village squares and around hearths, tales grew of entire towns wiped away overnight, of mysterious strangers bringing sickness, or of miracles that spared certain communities. These stories, often tinged with exaggeration, helped people make sense of what was otherwise incomprehensible. They turned catastrophe into narrative, something that could be shared, retold, and embedded into identity. Art captured the mood in haunting ways. The motif of the Danse Macabre, the dance of death, spread across murals and woodcuts. In these images, skeletons led kings, queens, merchants, peasants, and clergy alike into the grave, reminding viewers that mortality spared no rank or station. Far from purely grim, these works carried a moral lesson, the fleeting nature of earthly power and the inevitability of death. Such imagery spoke to both fear and acceptance, offering a shared language for a society still reeling. Literature also reflected the upheaval. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio framed his Decameron around a group of young Florentines fleeing the plague to a countryside villa, where they passed the time telling stories. Though the tales themselves ranged from comic to tragic, the premise captured the very human impulse to escape, to distract, and to process grief through narrative. The Black Death, In this way, seeded works that combined art with testimony, preserving both the horrors and the resilience of the age. Even rituals of remembrance evolved. Memorial masses became more common, as did donations to monasteries and the commissioning of altarpieces dedicated to the souls of the departed. Cemeteries expanded, and some communities marked mass graves with crosses or simple markers, physical reminders of collective loss. Over time, these practices wove the memory of the plague into the physical and spiritual landscape of Europe. The cultural memory of the Black Death ensured that it was never just a passing disaster. It became a touchstone, a point of reference for later generations facing famine, war, or new outbreaks of disease. In every sermon that warned of God's wrath, in every mural that depicted dancing skeletons, and in every story whispered by firelight, the shadow of the plague lived on. Universities and medical faculties of the 14th century wrestled with the catastrophe using the tools of medieval learning. Physicians trained in the tradition of Galen and Hippocrates framed the plague in terms of imbalances in the body's humors or corrupt airs spreading through the environment. Learned treatises circulated across Europe, filled with recommendations: avoid bathing in hot water, carry herbs like rosemary or lavender, or flee to higher, cleaner ground. These writings were not simply curiosities. They reflected earnest attempts to apply inherited wisdom to an overwhelming crisis. Astrologers, too, claimed authority. Charts were drawn, linking the outbreak to rare planetary conjunctions, when Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars were said to have aligned in a certain way. It was thought that poisonous vapors were released into the atmosphere, corrupting the very breath of humankind. Such explanations may seem distant to modern eyes, but they gave shape to an otherwise invisible threat and reassured many that order, however grim, still governed the cosmos. Kings, queens, and civic leaders faced dilemmas of both public health and public order. Some rulers commissioned prayers and processions, believing repentance could halt the pestilence. Others imposed rudimentary forms of quarantine. Ships arriving in Venetian harbors, for instance, were made to wait offshore for weeks before disembarking, a practice that would evolve into one of the earliest structured public health measures. City councils debated how to bury the dead, how to maintain markets, and how to prevent panic. Their responses reveal a medieval society groping toward practices that foreshadowed later governance of epidemics. Monasteries, once seen as strongholds of stability, suffered immense losses as monks and nuns devoted themselves to caring for the sick. Entire religious houses fell silent, their cloisters emptied by disease, yet their work left a profound impression on communities, reinforcing the association between service, piety, and sacrifice. At the same time, the staggering mortality among clergy created tensions. Parishes went unserved, confessions unheard, and doubts about the Church's capacity grew. These strains contributed to the shifting spiritual landscape of Europe in the following century. Intellectual circles slowly began to question whether inherited authorities were sufficient, though few in the 14th century openly discarded the frameworks of Galen or Aristotle. The scale of the plague planted seeds of doubt. Why had ancient knowledge failed to prevent such devastation? Quietly, the idea that observation, record-keeping, and comparison might yield better answers began to take hold. The Black Death did not spark modern science outright, but it nudged Europe onto a path where experience would one day weigh more heavily than tradition. Even in law and administration, the impact was felt. Wills multiplied in towns and villages, filling notarial books with testaments of people eager to set their affairs in order. Property passed rapidly from one hand to another, and governments faced the task of managing inheritances, debts, and disputes magnified by loss. The act of writing a will became almost routine, a way of acknowledging mortality and securing continuity in a world undone by uncertainty. These institutional and intellectual responses did not stop the plague, but they framed how society endured it. Knowledge, belief, governance, and record all became tools for confronting the unimaginable. In the shadow of mortality, Europe improvised structures that would echo for centuries in medicine, law, and the way communities understood themselves in times of crisis. The economic fabric of Europe was torn apart by sudden depopulation. Fields once carefully tilled lay neglected as laborers perished or fled. In some villages, plows rusted in their sheds, and harvests rotted where they stood uncollected. The immediate result was scarcity. Grain prices fluctuated wildly, and in certain regions, bread became both costly and unreliable. Yet, paradoxically, in places where too few mouths remained to consume the crops, surpluses piled up and spoiled, a bitter reminder of how unevenly the disaster struck. For the survivors, this imbalance altered daily bargaining. Wages for manual laborers rose as landowners competed for the dwindling supply of hands. Agricultural workers, herdsmen, and artisans all found themselves in positions to demand more favorable terms. Contracts preserved in manorial roles show peasants negotiating reduced obligations or securing higher pay, often for the first time in living memory. To the ruling elite, this shift appeared dangerously destabilizing. Laws were passed attempting to fix wages at pre-plague levels, a testimony to the fear that centuries of hierarchy might erode under the pressure of economic necessity. Markets, once bustling, fell eerily silent. Town squares where merchants hawked cloth, pottery, and spices became thinly attended. Caravans and river barges carried fewer goods, not because of shortages alone, but because fear clung to the very act of exchange. In some ports, sailors hesitated to unload wares from distant lands, worried that the cargo itself might conceal contagion. Trade routes did not vanish entirely, but the pace slowed to a crawl, and Europe's commercial heartbeat faltered. Guilds, powerful organizations of craftsmen and merchants, faced crises of membership. Tailors, bakers, weavers, and smiths alike saw their numbers diminish, sometimes so severely that certain trades in smaller towns nearly vanished. To adapt, guilds relaxed traditional restrictions. Apprentices were promoted more quickly to mastership, and outsiders were occasionally admitted to maintain continuity. These concessions, though temporary in intent, hinted at a loosening of the rigid social codes that had long governed urban labor. Meanwhile, in the countryside, some lords chose to consolidate. Abandoned peasant holdings were folded into larger estates, and sheep pastures spread where once grain had grown. Wool production, less dependent on human labor, gained favor among landowners struggling with shortages of tenants. This shift in land use was not universal, but where it occurred, it reshaped local economies for generations, laying groundwork for changes in European agriculture and trade. Charity, too, altered in tone. With so many in need, almshouses and hospitals strained under impossible burdens. Wealthier survivors often made donations in hopes of salvation, but the scale of suffering meant gifts were but drops in a sea of need. Still, records of bequests and endowments remind us that solidarity, however imperfect, threaded through the devastation. The rhythm of daily transactions, wages paid, goods exchanged, debts settled, became infused with new urgency. People knew life was uncertain. They sought to secure what they could, whether through contracts, alliances, or simple purchases. Even commerce, in its disrupted form, became a way of navigating mortality. A reminder that survival required not only faith in medicine, but also negotiation and adaptation. As the pestilence advanced, culture became a mirror of fear and memory. Across Europe, visual art absorbed the imagery of death with startling frankness. Church walls, once decorated with serene saints or heavenly visions, began to host macabre frescoes of skeletons, skulls, and dancing corpses. This danse macabre, or dance of death, served as a universal reminder that kings and peasants alike were bound by the same fate. Its imagery would recur for centuries, shaping medieval and early Renaissance art. Manuscript illuminations, too, began to reflect the turmoil of the age. Margins that had previously carried whimsical beasts and delicate vines were suddenly crowded with grim scenes. Monks in procession, Bodhis wrapped in shrouds, angels weighing souls. These illustrations were not simply decoration. They were warnings, woven into prayer books and devotional texts that circulated widely. Literature of the time carried similar marks. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio would frame the Decameron against the backdrop of plague-stricken Florence, his characters retreating to the countryside to tell tales while death ravaged the city. Elsewhere, sermons and chronicles attempted to capture the moral dimensions of the catastrophe. Some clerics framed the plague as divine punishment, a chastisement for sin. Others counseled humility and penance, urging communities to repent in hopes of divine mercy. The written word became both record and remedy, a way of imposing narrative order upon an experience that seemed otherwise unfathomable. Music, though less often preserved in direct testimony, bore its own witness. Laments and dirges, sung in funerary processions or whispered in cloisters, took on a sharper urgency. Some monasteries composed chants, pleading for protection, their melodies echoing the desperation of the faithful. Though much of this music is lost to us, surviving fragments suggest a culture that bent its art toward the task of grieving. Ritual, too, adapted to the crisis. Funeral customs shifted as death outpaced tradition. Individual burials gave way to mass graves in many towns, yet communities still sought ways to honor the departed. Crosses were erected at burial sites. Processions carried relics through the streets in hopes of divine intervention. In some places, flagellant movements spread. Bands of penitents walking barefoot through towns, scourging themselves to atone for humanity's sins. Their chants and rituals, though controversial in the eyes of church authorities, testified to a longing for meaning amid incomprehensible loss. Even architecture carried subtle traces of this age of suffering. Churches hastily built or expanded in the later 14th century sometimes incorporated imagery of saints associated with healing, like Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian. These figures, invoked against plague, became central to devotional life. Stained glass windows and statues alike bore silent witness to the reshaping of faith in the wake of calamity. The cultural responses to the Black Death were not merely reflections of despair. They also demonstrated resilience, the human impulse to create, to remember, and to frame catastrophe in forms that might endure beyond a single generation. Through fresco, manuscript, ritual, and chant, medieval Europe sought to express what words alone could scarcely contain: the immensity of collective grief, and the fragile hope that suffering might yet be redeemed. As the cultural and spiritual life of Europe bent under the shadow of the Black Death, people found ways to make meaning in the face of devastation. Through art, literature, prayer, ritual, and even processions of suffering, they tried to understand a disaster that seemed to defy all reason. These responses left behind a legacy that allows us, centuries later, to glimpse the emotions, fears, and hopes of those who lived through the pandemic. But while culture and faith gave people a way to express themselves, life had to go on. Daily survival was still at the core of existence, and families faced challenges inside their homes that were just as real as the plague outside their doors. So now, let us step quietly into the narrow alleys and wooden cottages of 14th century Europe. Imagine the dim light of a single fire, the smell of smoke in the rafters, and a family huddled together as the world outside falters. We will turn inward to explore how the Black Death shaped family life, households, and the most intimate bonds between men, women, and children. Inside the cottage, life was simple, but heavy with fear. The fire crackled low in the hearth, smoke drifting up toward the thatched roof and seeping out through gaps in the rafters. Families gathered close, both for warmth and for comfort, as the plague crept through their villages. The home was their refuge, yet also a place of constant worry. What if sickness entered through the very door they closed so tightly each night? Men, women, and children each carried their share of burdens within these fragile walls. The father, if still alive, was expected to maintain what little structure remained of daily work, perhaps tending to the animals, or repairing tools even as neighbors were carried to mass graves. The mother's role became heavier than ever. She was not only the caretaker of meals, of children, of small comforts, but often the one who nursed the sick. Women became the quiet front line, bathing fevers, changing linens, and whispering prayers over their loved ones. Children, once carefree in fields or lanes, were forced into silence and obedience. Many had to step into adult roles before their time helping with livestock, carrying water, or even tending to dying relatives. For some, play and laughter were replaced by hushed voices and the sound of church bells tolling endlessly in the distance. The household was not just a shelter, it was a mirror of survival. Every cough inside those walls stirred dread. Every empty chair at the table was a reminder of loss. And yet, within these small spaces, families also clung fiercely to each other, sharing bread, whispering stories, and praying that tomorrow might bring mercy. In many households, grief became as common as the daily chores. The moment a family member fell ill, the rhythm of life shifted sharply. Beds were moved closer to the fire for warmth, neighbors sometimes avoided visiting, and the family prepared in quiet dread for what was likely to come. There were few physicians available for peasants, and most remedies fell to the household itself. Herbs, steeped in hot water, charms hung above doors, or whispered prayers repeated into the night. When death came, as it often did, the cottage transformed into a place of mourning. Families improvised rituals, even when priests could not be summoned in time. A mother might wrap her child in a simple shroud made from old linen. A father, weary and silent, might carry the body to a waiting cart. Children, too young to grasp the full weight of the loss, clung to each other, staring at the empty bed. Grief was rarely private, for the sound of wailing often drifted from one cottage to the next, blending into a village-wide chorus of sorrow. Yet, even in mourning, there was a need for order. Small altars of wood or stone appeared inside homes, with candles flickering before images of saints. Families lit these flames not just for the dead, but as a desperate plea for protection for the living. Some families found comfort in storytelling. At night, when silence pressed too heavily, elders recited tales of ancestors who had endured famine, war, and hardship before. These stories were not meant to erase grief, but to remind the young that survival, though fragile, was still possible. In these moments, the home became both a place of mourning and of fragile hope, where memory and faith were woven into the walls. The plague did not only take lives, it rearranged family structures in ways that could be felt for generations. When fathers or elder brothers died, the responsibility for holding the household together often shifted suddenly. Widows became the heads of families, managing land, livestock, and decisions that would once have belonged to men. Though many communities frowned on women taking such authority, the crisis left little choice. Survival often meant bending the rules of tradition. Children were among the most deeply affected. With parents gone, some were absorbed into the households of relatives, while others became orphans, left to fend for themselves. In villages overwhelmed by death, older children often took on the care of younger siblings. What might have been a life of gradual apprenticeship or play was replaced with early labor and adult burdens. For many, childhood ended almost overnight. Inheritance patterns shifted as well. With so many deaths, property passed unexpectedly from one branch of a family to another. Younger sons who might never have expected to own land suddenly found themselves as heirs. Daughters, too, sometimes inherited when no male kin remained. These changes quietly loosened the rigid structures of medieval family life. creating openings for new roles and responsibilities that would not have been possible before. Marriage, too, bore the strain of the plague. Many unions were cut short by death, leaving young widows and widowers in vulnerable positions. Yet, in the aftermath, remarriage became common, not only as a means of companionship, but also as a practical arrangement for rebuilding households. Families blended together, with stepchildren and new alliances forming, reshaping what it meant to be kin in a time of crisis. Inside every cottage, these changes played out in countless small ways. The empty chair at the hearth, the sudden weight of new duties, the blending of families after remarriage, all were markers of how the Black Death altered not just villages, but the intimate bonds of home. Food, already a fragile aspect of medieval existence, became even more uncertain during the years of the Black Death. With fields lying untended and workers dying faster than they could be replaced, supplies dwindled. Inside cottages, families stretched what little they had. Bread was often coarse and made from whatever grains could be gathered, sometimes barley, rye, or oats, with wheat reserved for those with more wealth. Families relied heavily on preserved goods. Salted meat, smoked fish, and dried beans became staples when fresh food was scarce. Mothers carefully rationed what was left in storage, deciding each day how to divide portions among the children. Hunger sharpened the sense of loss, and mealtimes were often quiet, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire or the sound of spoons scraping wooden bowls. Scarcity also forced creativity. Weeds and herbs once dismissed as undesirable found their way into stews. Nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic added substance to meals, while nuts and berries gathered from hedgerows supplemented diets when fields failed. Some families even turned to foraging mushrooms or trapping small animals, though these acts carried risk if mistaken plants or meats brought illness. The rhythm of meals also changed. Instead of the two hearty meals common in calmer times, many households reduced themselves to a single pot of stew that might last across the day. Sharing food became a ritual of survival, a reminder of community within the family. Children often received the largest portions, while adults quietly endured smaller servings, their sacrifice unspoken but deeply felt. Beyond the cottage, scarcity strained relationships with neighbors. Borrowing grain or exchanging a hen for milk became acts of negotiation, laced with desperation. Sometimes solidarity triumphed, with neighbors helping one another in the name of survival. At other times, suspicion and fear outweighed generosity, and doors remained closed, even to those most in need. Inside the dim walls of the home, hunger and rationing carved new habits into daily life. Meals became less about nourishment and more about holding a fragile sense of normalcy, keeping alive the rhythm of family. Even as the world outside seemed to dissolve, fear of the plague pushed families to create private rituals of protection, blending Christian faith with lingering folk traditions. Inside cottages, crucifixes were hung above doors, not just as symbols of devotion, but as barriers meant to keep sickness away. Some families burned herbs like rosemary or juniper, believing the fragrant smoke would cleanse the air. Others carried small relics, or charms, perhaps a saint's medal, or even a scrap of parchment, inscribed with holy words, tucked beneath clothing, as a shield against unseen forces. Prayer punctuated the rhythms of home life. Mothers taught children to murmur simple psalms before bed, while fathers sometimes knelt openly by the hearth, praying aloud for mercy. Candles flickered late into the night, their flames both practical and symbolic, offering light against the encroaching darkness. In homes that could afford it, images of saints or the Virgin Mary were set into small wooden shrines, where flowers or bits of cloth were laid as humble offerings. Yet alongside these acts of faith lived older, folk-rooted practices. Villagers hung sprigs of ivy or garlic at cottage doors. Some placed iron tools near the threshold, believing that sharp metal could drive away evil spirits. Children were sometimes given charms, carved from bone or wood, whispered over by elders who claimed ancient knowledge. These gestures did not replace religion, but existed alongside it, woven into the daily fabric of household protection. Rituals extended even to the sick. Families might wash an ill child's face with water blessed by a traveling priest, or place a rosary beneath a dying person's hand. Even when death seemed inevitable, these small acts gave meaning and comfort, ensuring that no life slipped away entirely without grace. For families, these rituals were less about certainty than about hope. In a time when no cure seemed possible, the repetition of prayers, the lighting of candles, and the hanging of charms offered at least the feeling of control. Inside the fragile walls of each cottage, these small practices became part of the rhythm of survival, binding family members together in shared acts of faith. Beyond rituals of faith and the management of daily survival, what held many households together was the bond of family itself. In a world where loss seemed unavoidable, small gestures became deeply significant. A mother braiding her daughter's hair by firelight, a father carving a wooden toy for his son, or siblings whispering stories to one another under rough blankets. These quiet acts of tenderness preserved humanity in the face of despair. Families also leaned on routines, however modest, to give life a fragile rhythm. Even when food was scarce, meals were still shared at the same spot by the hearth. Children still recited prayers before sleep, and tools were repaired with care even when fields lay fallow. These repetitions reminded everyone that life had not entirely unraveled, that there were threads of normalcy to cling to. Music and song sometimes broke the silence of grief. A lullaby hummed by a mother, or a chant recalled from church, carried both comfort and memory into the home. For children, these songs became anchors of safety. For adults, they were reminders that beauty still existed, even amid devastation. Families also nurtured resilience through memory. Elders often spoke of earlier hardships, harsh winters, years of famine, or wars that had swept through the land. These stories were not just laments, they were lessons, reminding the young that humanity had always endured suffering and had found ways to carry on. In this way, memory acted as a kind of inheritance, passed from one generation to the next. The cottage, then, was not only a place of shelter, but a vessel of love, grief, and resilience. Its walls held laughter and tears in equal measure, and though the plague reshaped every bond within, it also highlighted the deep reliance families had on one another. To survive meant not only to endure hunger and fear, but to hold close the people who made life meaningful, even in its most fragile form. When death entered a home, as it so often did, the family had to find ways to carry grief without being crushed by it. Mourning was not only an emotional act, but a practical one. Clothes were sometimes dyed darker using soot or earth, not out of vanity, but to mark the heaviness of the household. A simple sprig of herbs hung above the door told neighbors that sorrow lived within those walls. Children, too young to fully grasp the scale of loss, often asked quiet questions about where their loved ones had gone. Parents answered as best they could, weaving death into the familiar fabric of faith. They spoke of eternal rest, of journeys beyond this world, or of watching over the living from above. These explanations did not erase pain, but they gave shape to the incomprehensible. Grief also altered the rhythm of the cottage. Silence lingered where laughter had once been. Empty seats around the hearth seemed louder than words. Yet, in time, families found small ways to fill the spaces left behind. A child might take on chores, once handled by a departed parent. A surviving elder might teach songs or prayers once sung by another. In this way, absence slowly became part of daily life, woven into the household's new pattern. Acts of remembrance gave comfort as well. A wooden spoon once used by a lost mother was set aside rather than discarded. A cloak belonging to a father might be hung near the bed, both a memory and a presence. Such objects became quiet memorials, allowing grief to exist without overwhelming the fragile balance of survival. Above all, the cottage remained a place where hope was whispered, even when it felt far away. Families spoke of seasons yet to come, fields greening again, festivals returning, children growing into adulthood. These conversations, tentative though they were, reminded the living that their lives still stretched forward, even when so much had been taken away. Cooking during the plague years often became an act of quiet ingenuity. With markets thinly supplied and neighbors reluctant to share, households made do with what was close at hand. Dried beans and peas, salted fish, or small stores of barley could stretch a family through a lean week. Families boiled thin gruel in heavy pots suspended above the hearth, adding whatever herbs or scraps could be spared. The taste was plain, but the act of eating together offered a rhythm that carried them through long days. When flour was scarce, some households ground acorns or chestnuts into a coarse substitute. The bitter taste lingered on the tongue, yet it filled empty stomachs. Children sometimes complained, but even they came to understand that food was precious. It was not uncommon to see households carefully rationing even the smallest lump of cheese or storing roots in earthen jars sealed with clay to last through colder months. For illness, remedies were tried not only because they might work, but because doing nothing at all felt unbearable. Bundles of sage, rue, or rosemary were boiled into teas, meant to clear the air within the lungs. Some rubbed vinegar on their skin, believing it could repel sickness. Others carried dried lavender in pouches tied around the neck, hoping its scent would guard the body. These practices rarely brought real protection, but they offered a fragile sense of control. Warmth, too, became a measure of survival. When firewood grew scarce, families scavenged hedgerows for fallen branches, or dried dung for burning. Hearths were tended with care, embers buried beneath ash each night so they could be coaxed alive by morning. Blankets were shared, and beds crowded. In poorer homes, all generations sometimes slept in the same room, the simple closeness of their bodies helping to guard against the chill. These adaptations, humble as they were, gave households the ability to endure. They were reminders that while disease swept mercilessly outside, life inside still pressed on through the smallest acts: cooking, tending, warming, remembering. Even as households tried to remain sealed, few could live entirely cut off. There were moments when some form of contact became unavoidable. To avoid stepping too close, families developed small rituals of cautious exchange. A jug of milk might be left on a doorstep with no knock, only the faint sound of footsteps retreating. In return, a loaf of bread or a bundle of onions might appear the next morning. The trade complete without a single word spoken. Some households devised signals, quiet markers that only neighbors understood. A cloth tied to a shutter might mean a family required firewood. A sprig of greenery placed near the doorway could indicate they were willing to barter. These signs carried no guarantees, but they allowed for help without demanding face-to-face conversation. In a time of fear, such unspoken agreements created a fragile safety net. Not all contact was material. Sometimes it was the comfort of sound that reached through walls and across narrow lanes. A mother humming softly as she stirred, the hearth pot could be heard by the family across the alley. And in that simple tune lay reassurance. Someone else was still enduring. At dusk, children whispered to one another from windows, their voices hushed but eager, bridging the gap between homes without crossing thresholds. Clergy and lay healers, though themselves wary, often left written prayers, charms, or small tokens at doors, believing they could carry divine strength into a dwelling. Whether these offered protection or not mattered less than the fact that they symbolized remembrance. A household that received such a token knew it had not been forgotten, even in the shadow of plague. This network of discreet gestures allowed communities to function, however faintly. It was not the bustling life of crowded markets and taverns, but a quiet thread of survival woven house by house, gesture by gesture. And in that fragile thread, people found a reason to keep going. When practical tasks were finished and the day dimmed, many families turned to the only resource that asked nothing in return: their own voices. Storytelling became both comfort and distraction. Parents recited old folk tales, speaking of kings and tricksters, of saints who had endured suffering greater than their own. These stories carried a rhythm that calmed children and steadied adults alike. In moments when despair pressed too close, a well-remembered tale could keep fear from overtaking silence. Prayer also shaped the evenings. Some households recited the same words night after night, anchoring themselves in the repetition of ritual. Others whispered improvised petitions, fragile and deeply personal, asking for strength, forgiveness, or the sparing of a loved one's life. Even those who doubted the church's explanations often clung to prayer as a form of structure, a way of measuring time when ordinary clocks of daily work had been disrupted. Objects of memory carried power too. A father might polish a knife once given to him by his own parent, running his thumb along the worn handle as if holding the past could promise a future. Mothers preserved scraps of fabric from a grandmother's gown, showing them to children as evidence of lives once lived. These relics, however ordinary, allowed households to tether themselves to continuity, reminding them that life had stretched before plague and might someday stretch after it. Some families even began to keep their own small records, marks carved into doorframes, tallying days endured without illness, scraps of parchment noting which prayers were said or which relatives had passed. These small archives were both practical and spiritual attempts to order chaos, to ensure that memory would not be swallowed by silence. Through these practices, homes became more than shelters. They were transformed into archives of faith, stories, and memory, fragile but resilient, holding within them the tools that allowed people to endure one of history's darkest winters, as the Black Death lingered and reshaped the lives of those who survived. Households carried both sorrow and resilience in equal measure. Inside cottages and townhouses, families leaned on stories, prayer, memory, and simple human closeness to steady themselves. They lived with uncertainty, yet carved out moments of warmth amid the shadows. In those fragile bonds, daily life continued, not as it once had, but as best it could, step by step, night by night. And in that quiet endurance, the medieval family left us not only a tale of suffering, but also of survival. And now, as you drift deeper into rest, let the sounds of medieval hearths and whispered prayers fade gently into the background. Tonight, you've walked through narrow alleys, entered cottages lit only by the glow of a single candle, and felt what it was like to live through one of history's most haunting moments. But this is only one chapter in the great story of the past. In our next journey together, we'll turn to a new chapter of history, one even more layered, curious, and calming than this one. So, as you close your eyes, let your mind settle, knowing that the next story may be even more sleep-inducing, guiding you once again into the soft embrace of the past. Good night, and may your dreams carry you gently through the echoes of history.